Today we start with an ancient dislike and mistrust of redheads across time and many cultures. And then as Christianity grows, this mistrust is depicted in our religious art. Then finally, as a new wave of mistrust, hatred, even bigotry grows, it gets merged with the ancient one about redheads. So join us today as we investigate the curious case of the red-haired Judas. Welcome to the Sky Pilot podcast that explores questions of faith, spirituality, and religion. I'm Dan Matthews, and I don't have all the answers, but I do enjoy the questions. Welcome to the podcast where every question is an invitation into a spiritual quest, and you're invited along for the journey. Hi, welcome to Sky Pilot Faith Quest podcasts and videos. I'm Dan, this is Quark, and we're your co-pilots for today's spiritual adventure. If you've been here before, welcome back, and please like, subscribe, and ring the bell. It really helps the channel and it'll help you be notified of more episodes in the future. Now, let's blast off. Let's start with what we see in art. From medieval paintings to Renaissance masterpieces, Judas Iscariot is often easy to spot. He's the one with red hair.
Curious, why does this even matter?
Well, it matters to me for a couple of reasons. First, a number of years ago, I was teaching a class in the church where I was serving on the stained glass windows in that church. And during the research of our windows and the research I was doing of windows in other places, I kept noticing that Judas had red hair in many of those stained glass windows. Now, let's be clear, Judas didn't have red hair, and more on that in a moment. So why is he depicted that way? Oh, also, it's doubly interesting to me because I have red hair.
Had red hair.
Yeah, that's what I said. Anyway, I grew up with red hair, so I'm keenly aware of it whenever I see it, and I was seeing it a lot in old artistic depictions of Judas. So I started to investigate. Now, Judas is often shown as a redhead. Not always, but often enough that art historians themselves have taken notice. Look, there's nothing in the Bible to tell us anything about how any of the disciples looked, but archaeology and just basic research can lead us to a pretty safe assumption that Jesus and all of his disciples had dark hair, brown skin, and brown eyes. So where did this idea of Judas being a redhead come from? Well, here we go. Let's get into it. Red hair, especially in the context of European history, has long been seen as suspicious, untrustworthy, even dangerous. But it goes back further than that. We can go back to ancient Rome, where red hair was sometimes associated with tribes that were seen as barbaric, like the Gauls or the Celts. And this wasn't unique to Rome. It was true across many cultures in ancient times. Now, fast forward a few centuries, and in medieval Europe, red hair had developed a whole set of negative associations. Witches were often said to have red hair. So were vampires. In some cultures, redheads were said to be hot-tempered, deceitful, even soulless.
So?
Yeah, not a word from you on that. So in this context, it made a certain sense for Christian artists, many of whom were deeply influenced by the biases of their time, to paint Judas with red hair or to put him in stained glass with red hair. It was a visual shorthand for he's the bad guy. Now, only part of the story is revealed in what I've told you so far. The other more troubling part of the story is this. The depiction of Judas with red hair is closely tied to the rise of anti-Semitism in Christian Europe. Judas was Jewish, but so were all of the apostles, and of course so was Jesus. But over time, Christian theology and art began to use Judas as a symbol of not just betrayal, but of the Jews as a whole. In the Middle Ages, Judas had become a figure through which Christian artists and theologians could express growing anti-Jewish sentiment. He wasn't just a man who betrayed Jesus, he became the Jew who betrayed Jesus. And the red hair, it became another marker, another way to, as we say, other Judas visually, to separate him from the rest of the apostles, and by implication to paint the Jewish people as distinct, dangerous, and untrustworthy. Now, some medieval texts even describe Jews as having red hair and ruddy complexions, again, using the same visual markers associated with Judas. This became part of a broader cultural redefining, creating an image of Jews as kind of the enemy within. So when you see a red-haired Judas in a medieval painting, you're not just looking at a man who betrayed Jesus, you're looking at the embodiment of a growing, dangerous ideology, and one that would, as I think we know now, have devastating consequences for centuries to come. Now, we can trace these associations back to around the 12th and 13th centuries in Western Europe, especially in countries like England, France, and parts of Germany. This was an era when anti-Semitism began to grow. And I know there are people out there going, yeah, anti-Semitism was not invented in the 12th and 13th century, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it didn't exist before then, but in this time period, it really began to intensify, often supported, unfortunately, by the church. Blood libel myths began to circulate. Blood libel myths are accusations that Jews were kidnapping Christian children for ritual sacrifice. Often the idea was, and the stories were told, that they were using their blood in their Passover rituals. Now, the Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, and from Spain in 1492. And this was not a slow simmer. It seems to have developed rather suddenly. Let's look at England, for example. William the Conqueror is said to have invited the Jews from Normandy to come settle in England around 1070. Yet, a short 2 centuries later, King Edward I of England is ordering the expulsion of all Jews who were living in England at the time. It's no coincidence that this era was also when Judas started to appear more frequently in art with demonic features, sometimes with a severely hooked and oversized nose, twisted expression, and yes, red hair. These depictions weren't just artistic decisions, they were part of a campaign to scapegoat and vilify the Jewish people. Judas became the symbol, the stereotype, the proof that Jews were inherently treacherous. So why talk about this today? Well, for a couple of reasons. First, anti-Semitism is on the rise. Again, like in the historical past, it isn't on a slow uptick. It's a sudden, sharp, and alarming rise. And just as important and very much related, I'm releasing this episode in Holy Week, a week in which we tell the story of Jesus' experience of being betrayed, tried, and executed. And we need to be careful about what we take away from that story when we hear it, when we read it, when we tell it during Holy Week. Was Jesus betrayed by a Jew? Was he betrayed by all Jews? Was he betrayed by Judaism in general? Obviously, the answer is no.
Well, if it were actually obvious, you would not be making this episode.
Okay, yeah, that's a fair point. When we make Judas the archetype of Jewishness, we miss a key and important part of the historical narrative, and, maybe more importantly, the biblical story. Jesus was Jewish. That is keenly a part of the biblical story, and at no point did Jesus abandon Judaism or denounce it. Now, before anyone says, well, he did make some pretty strong condemnations of it, especially in his last week of life, let me say again, he doesn't ever say anything along the lines of Judaism is dead, I'm bringing you a new faith to replace the old bankrupt one. Matter of fact, he quite the opposite says, no, I am preserving Judaism. Oh, and think about it from this perspective. If Jesus were to return today and walk among us, do you think he would be any kinder to the state of the Christian church today? I don't care what denomination you belong to or which particular church you attend, no one would get off without some sort of chastisement, some sort of rebuke if he came to visit your church.
Now you've got me curious. Should we remove the stained glass windows that depict Judas as a redhead?
Yeah, I would understand any church that did, but I think I would go in a different direction. I think I would use it, and we did in our church, I would use it as a teaching opportunity, to use it as a visual reminder that even within a community of faith, bigotry and hatred can be placed on display in some very subtle and yet powerful ways. So I think if you don't remove it physically, you have to make a concerted effort to erase its lingering effects. You have to point to it, explain it, tell why it happened, and then regularly reinforce the point that we don't believe that anymore, and we stand against anyone who does. And that's all for this week.
Wait, and what about Judas? What should we do with him?
Yeah, that's really interesting. The natural inclination when reading about Judas is to see the story as, oh, that guy, he did that. He's responsible for it. But Judas isn't the story of a strange demonic outlier who betrayed Jesus. Judas is the story of a follower and a friend who betrayed Jesus. My hunch is that Judas isn't the story of a guy who was intent on evil, but instead someone who thought in the moment, in some way, he was doing the right thing. Maybe even thought he was doing God's will in the moment. He may have thought that having Jesus arrested was going to force Jesus' hand, force Jesus to step up and take the reins in a more political role, and that's already we know there were lots of people around at the time who wanted Jesus to do exactly that. So as much as we want to portray the story of Judas as he's other, he's not us, the true lesson is that Judas is not the story of him. Judas is our story. Those of us who proclaim Jesus Christ, Jesus as our Christ, and claim to follow him as our Savior, we all have Judas moments. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have more of them than we'd like to admit. Moments in which we fall short of how Jesus taught us to live, taught us to treat each other. You know, like when we blame the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ. Thanks for watching and joining me. Remember to be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. And on your spiritual journey, may you ask questions, seek answers, and boldly go wherever the quest takes you. Thanks for joining us here today and being part of the SkyPilot Faith Quest community. This is a great place to ask questions you wouldn't feel comfortable or safe asking in other places. And remember, the sign of a strong faith, solid religion, or healthy spiritual journey is not certainty, but that you keep asking questions.